I get better food, it's fresher, it's no packaging, and my grocery budget is actually a vote for a better food system. It's activism in its own right, just by choosing to shop that way.
In 2008, Pete Russell launched a technology platform designed to level the playing field for small-scale food producers who compete in a global food system that can often feel stacked against them. So this is a fascinating David and Goliath story, and Pete shares it on this episode of Food Matters. Welcome back to the show. I'm Mick Kelly, and in this series I'm meeting the people who are reconnecting us with real, healthy, sustainable food. They tell us why food matters to them and why it should matter to you too. Pete Russell was running a $12 million food company when he suddenly had a major epiphany, realizing he was part of a broken food system that was forcing small-scale family farms and artisans out of business, and he wanted to be part of the solution rather than the problem. And so Ooooby was born, a platform that connects small food producers directly with consumers, making it easy for people to access locally grown produce, supporting sustainable farming practices. On this episode of Food Matters, Pete shares the fascinating story of why he wound down a multi-million-dollar business to help create a more equitable food system.
I just remember sitting in the car park and not wanting to get out of the car, not wanting to go into that building, not wanting to have the meeting with those people because it was soulless. It wasn't a real conversation with a real person. The iPhone came out. When I saw the phone, which was this one big screen of glass, I thought, that's going to be the supermarket of the future. That's going to be where everything happens, I believed. And so the idea was, how do we build the technology to enable small-scale food to gain an equal footing or a solid footing in that marketplace, in that online marketplace where it leveled the playing field. I remember one of the things about running the patisserie ourselves, I was eating a lot of sugar because I'd go downstairs and I'd just, eat croissants and Danish and so forth. And I actually got it to a point where my bones were starting to ache and I knew it was diet related. I was like, something's not quite right with this.
So like with any great story, it's always best to start right at the start. So Pete kicks things off by taking me back to the beginning of his amazing journey. So Pete, it's fantastic to have you on the pod. We've met once in person, and I think to both of our surprise, we realised it was back in 2012 that you visited Waterford for a GOI gathering a long time ago. And you guys kind of started around the same time as GIY. We started 2008. It was something similar for you. So you would have been in Waterford kind of pretty early days, like 12 years ago, but it would have been close to the beginning for Ooooby.
Absolutely. Yeah, we did start in 2008, and it was about 3 and a bit years into it that you very kindly invited me to come and join the gathering, which I still remember very clearly. It was a fantastic event.
Yeah. And we had actually Mark Diacono on the podcast recently, who was also there at that time, and Alice Fowler was there as well. It was actually probably, didn't know it at the time, but it was probably the high point for the for the gathering. It all went to shit shortly after that. But anyway.
Well, it was a very high point, so I really enjoyed it. Yeah,
it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. So look, it's brilliant. And I was also thinking that, like, when you visited Waterford that time, you were based in New Zealand, but you're not too far away from us now in Devon. How's life treating you there?
Life's good here. Life is great here. I mean, we were living in New Zealand. I'm actually Australian, but my wife is British. So we were in New Zealand because it was neutral territory for both of us. We actually moved to New Zealand in 2008, and that was when we started Ooooby. We moved there from Australia, but we've now been here in the UK, in Dartington, which is near Totnes in Devon, for 5 years.
Oh, wow. And are you doing a bit of growing and farming yourself there, or are you too busy for all that malarkey?
Not this time. When we were in New Zealand, we were living in an eco-village and we were growing, good food there. Yeah, where we are right now is we've got our kids growing up. They're taking up a lot of time. Obviously, Ooooby's taking up a lot of time. So other than, the occasional veggie patch sort of harvest, there's not much going on, unfortunately.
Yeah. I'm just thinking now that it was Susie Khan who runs a place called Carrickdulra in Wicklow that introduced me. She
correct.
set up an Ooooby, right? In very early days. So she was on our board in GOI at the time and introduced me to the whole idea, and I loved it from the get-go. So what I'd love you to start maybe to tell us a little about what fascinates me about your story is that it's a little bit similar to mine in that I came from a kind of business background and, albeit not related to food, but your story is something similar in that you come from sort of good, big food pedigree, if you don't mind me saying. So working for Source Food Australia, or founding that organisation. So tell us a little bit about that and what you were doing and how that sort of led you to your road to Damascus moment.
Yeah. Well, prior to founding Source Food Australia, we were actually running an artisanal patisserie in Marrickville in Sydney, and we were producing fresh pastries, croissants, Danish, and so on, every day from scratch, and selling them to small independent cafes all around Sydney. And it was a great business. It was very hands-on. The kitchen was operating 24/7. I wanted to grow the business. I was, young and ambitious, and I really wanted to grow the business. But what we found was that in order for us to be able to supply more, like produce more food, we would have to invest in a bigger kitchen and all the equipment and the salaries, wages and things like that. But what we discovered was that actually we could partner up with the largest manufacturer of authentic continental pastries from Europe, and we could buy them par-baked, frozen, and ship them across the equator down to Australia.
Wow.
And we could supply as much as we wanted to whoever we wanted with an exclusive arrangement. And so we did. We started buying in, and we joined the big food group, the grouping of large centralized food companies, and we were buying from massive companies, and we were selling to massive companies. It was a gravy train. It was amazing. Worked a lot less hard and made a lot more money. Without realizing it, we started taking massive amounts of market share away from our own business, where we were making things from scratch, and our own employees. And we were also, as a small scale business, and we were also taking a lot of business from all the other small scale artisanal patisseries out there, because we could produce a very high quality, very consistent, massive supply. We could fill all the supermarket shelves all at once. That happened really quickly. I think it was in 2006 that we sent our first shipping container across the water, or we received our first shipping container. And by 2008, we were doing over $1 million a month in sales, and it was only going north from there.
Wow. It's the classic sort of story of human ambition and entrepreneurship, and like finding ways to do things kind of better and cheaper. And that is the story of the food system, I suppose, in many ways. But I'm curious, like, how did you feel as an artisan? Like, you started as an artisan. At the back of your mind somewhere where you're like, this is not artisan, this is...
It crept up on me. Obviously, I was distracted by the money. And but it did creep up on me. I remember going to a meeting once at the headquarters for Woolworths, which is a big supermarket chain over there. I just remember sitting in the car park and not wanting to get out of the car, not wanting to go into that building, not wanting to have the meeting with those people, because it was soulless. It wasn't a real conversation with a real person. It wasn't talking about pastries. It was talking about widgets and numbers and units and, promotions and this and that. And it wasn't my scene. And I actually felt sick going to those meetings. I just didn't enjoy it. Like, we were making good money, but I wasn't enjoying my work. But it's one of those things, as you make enough money, you kind of just shrug that other stuff off. But it was really only when the 2008 financial crisis hit, which effectively capsized our business overnight, because we were paying in euros. And so the exchange rate spike meant that our costs, went up like over 30% overnight, which meant we were making losses overnight. And the day before we were making profits. That was the catalyst that made me think, okay, firstly, I've got to look at things differently. Secondly, I've got to think about what sort of food system am I a part of when a financial crisis can bring the whole thing to a halt, and how much of our food system is built like this. So how fragile is our food system that something like a financial crisis could actually really have such a huge detrimental effect on moving food around and getting people fed. And then, that paired with the fact that our son had just been born and that I was feeling yuck about the business anyway, about doing the business work anyway. And then this realization that a resilient food system going into a future which looked more and more volatile had to be the other end of the spectrum. It had to be smaller scale, interconnected, independent food producers all working coordinated together rather than this large centralized sort of concentration of power. Once that idea got into my head, that was it. There was just no way I could continue on. So even though we were able to get the importing and distribution business back on its feet and, make it profitable again, I'd already checked out at that point. And I was already obsessed with this idea of applying the lessons I'd learned in large scale food to creating or helping to create a small scale food market effectively.
It strikes me then, your story, I said, like classic sort of tale of human ambition and entrepreneurship and finding efficiencies and so on. But also that, as you say, the sort of vulnerability of those big food companies is pretty stellar. And the bigger they get, the more vulnerable they are, and the more vulnerable we all are to the sort of the food insecurity that comes with that. And ironically, your original sort of artisan business would probably have been less vulnerable to that financial crisis at the time than that big importing operation would have been.
Indeed. And in fact, I think the reason it would be less vulnerable is because it's more human. Like, one of the things that happens at a small scale size of business is when people are having a difficult time, you can have a conversation with someone who connects with you as a human and you can figure things out.
Yeah.
When we went into this situation where overnight our costs skyrocketed, do you think I was able to talk to the human at the supermarket and say, oh, look, can we adjust our prices?
Yeah.
There was just no way. The human at the supermarket was not in human mode. And that's the problem.
Spreadsheet mode.
And that, I think, is a big problem of the larger an organization gets, the more levels of abstraction there are and the less humanity there is. It's a much more sort of cutthroat environment. And you hear about that when these days when you hear about the way that farmers are being treated by supermarkets, as it's an asymmetrical relationship. It's inherent in large scale food, and we got to experience that directly.
Yeah. Your idea was to take the systems and the tech in particular that you'd seen work in, I suppose, big food in inverted commas, and apply it to, I suppose, an alternative local food system, like, working with local food producers and growers. Like, how did it get from that idea to the first reality or the first iteration of Ooooby?
Yeah, so it was mainly the systems and processes that I observed in the large scale food world that I kind of ported across. At the time, the technology wasn't really the thing. I mean, we were still filling out cardboard, slips for the supermarkets on their formatting. That was the same year that the iPhone came out. When I saw the phone, which was this one big screen of glass, I thought, that's going to be the supermarket of the future. That's going to be where everything happens, I believed. And so the idea was, how do we build the technology to enable small-scale food to gain an equal footing or a solid footing in that marketplace, in that online marketplace where it leveled the playing field, where you no longer had to have massive acres of warehousing or acres and acres of retail footprint and car park and so forth to compete. We were able to compete equally on these 13 square inches of glass that people were carrying around in their pocket. So that was the original idea, was how could we build technology to take small-scale food online to catch that new sort of paradigm of shopping. That was a vague concept. At first, we tried a few different ways of just supporting people to be able to trade back food that was literally grown in their own backyards. So, because that's
hence the name Ooooby, right?
Hence the name Ooooby. It's 4 rows, BY stands for out of our own backyards.
Yeah. So I should say, Pete, at this juncture, like we use Ooooby, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But every time I put it into a document to discuss something at a meeting or whatever, I don't put enough O's in there. So I always do like OOOBY, but it's
that's all right.
It's out of our own backyard. So
out of our own
BY.
backyards. Yeah, it's 4 O's BY. I've got muscle memory now. I can't type 3 O's. I can only do 4 at a time. At first, the idea was sort of helping, like literally backyard gardeners to be able to trade their food with each other and sort of barter effectively. We set up like a stall at a local farmers market to represent backyard gardeners. But what we realized quickly was that the people that were the most important in our food system weren't the backyard gardeners at this stage. It was the small-scale farmers that were trying to make a living growing and selling food. The backyard gardeners was more of a hobby, and it was a nice little sideline, and it was, a passion project, which was great, and we still want to encourage that.
Yeah.
But what we didn't want to do was facilitate backyard gardeners to take market share away from these small-scale farmers who are actually trying to make a living. We then pivoted away from facilitating backyard gardening to just bigger backyards, right? Small-scale independent commercial farmers and, market gardeners and the like. And that's at the point where we really took the technology from being like a social network for backyard gardeners to being an online trading platform for small-scale producers, farmers and market gardeners. And that's where we started to build software as effectively an e-commerce platform, where originally we were doing all of the handling and all the deliveries and things ourselves and using the software to do the sales and managing all the logistics. And the idea was, if we do all of that hands-on stuff between the gate and the plate, and we do all the packing and we do all the deliveries and so on, we'll learn the real-world scenario that we can build our software against. And then after a year or two, we should have the software ready to be able to then sort of make that available to small farms and food hubs around wherever. But then 9 years later, we were still in the thick of it, still doing all the handling. And we'd grown a lot, and we'd opened up hubs in Sydney in Australia and in Christchurch, and plus the original one in Auckland. And we had a few others running around, different places. But we were still in that operational phase. And so it was only in 2019 when we finally moved to just the software, where we were able to sort of realize that original vision of us providing the digital infrastructure for local communities and regions to be able to run their own small-scale food sales and distribution direct from gate to plate.
I'm interested in the transition from the backyard grower social network sort of thing, because like over the years, I suppose, as with GIY, like I've often either had people say to me or been approached with people for an idea of like unlocking the produce from backyard growers and saying, that could be an alternative to the food system. And I've always been, like yourself, like super skeptical about that, actually, because as a grower myself, I know the surpluses are kind of almost, depending on the year that's in it, and my growing skills can be non-existent. Like, so it strikes me that if these organizations like yourself and like GIY are to mean anything, they have to be a kind of an alternative, or at least part of an alternative to the existing food system. So it's really interesting to me that you kind of felt the same, about the potential for backyard growers. Like, I think about it, I don't really like the word hobby because I think it's much more important than that. But I do agree with you that, the ability for backyard growers to sort of represent some kind of an alternative to the existing food system is just a bit naive and a bit kind of not a reality. Was that your sense of it as well?
I mean, I think ultimately it can become a reality again.
It's not where we are now, right?
It's not where we are yet. There's a sequence that has to occur, like prerequisites that need to occur before you can realistically see something like backyard gardens start to contribute to a food system or a food market. The first realization was, well, what we don't want to do is create another competitor for the people who are well positioned to actually start to reclaim the market share. Like when I think about into the future, I imagine that once there is enough of a critical mass of, farms and food hubs running on the platform that do the bulk of, the staple food that households need, that there will be an opportunity for someone who has effectively a micro farm or a backyard garden farm to be able to contribute to the supply of what's being sold on the platform. One of the things that we built into the system was this, little tokens called rubies, which are effectively like store credits, but with the idea that, one day you'd be able to, sell whatever you've got in your garden into the distribution network and be paid in these store credits, which then you can spend on other food that's in the system. I don't think it's an impossible thing. It's just the prerequisite is you need to have the infrastructure, which is an amalgamation of all the different farms and food hubs around the place, which provide the packing sheds and the delivery vehicles and the logistical capacity. Then people can start to plug their backyards into the system.
Yeah. The reality, I think, for most back garden growers, including myself, I've been growing for 20 years, like there's an extraordinary amount of skill in producing food commercially for sale. And, just the reality, I think, for most people is that while they're growing is very important to them, and I think it can be life-changing completely. You might have surpluses at times. I think for a lot of people, turning those surpluses into sort of year-round eating at home or whatever is finding ways to store it and so on. But the length of time I've been doing it, I'd hate to be kind of relying on my growing skills to make any money, or having to say, oh, well, at the end of this week, I've got to provide a box of whatever into a local system to support it, because I just don't have the skills to do it properly, and that's the big part of it. I'm really interested in wondering as well about, did you have a sense either when you were CEO of Source Food Australia or later on in the early days of Ooooby, were you thinking about the impact of the commercial food system on people's health and the health of the planet? Was that sort of part of the equation for founding Ooooby?
Yeah, it was. In fact, it was, I think my wife is very health focused. Looking at it through her lens was where I could see that very clearly. I remember one of the things about running the patisserie ourselves, I was eating a lot of sugar because I'd go downstairs and I'd just, eat croissants and Danish and so forth. And I actually got it to a point where my bones were starting to ache, and I knew it was diet related. I was, something's not quite right with this. So I was starting to see, health implications just in myself. It was such an obvious thing that it was like, yeah, well, that clearly is a major benefit of small scale and either homegrown or grown locally and eaten within, a day or two of it being harvested with all the nutrient density and so forth. I mean, one of the benefits of this system is that it runs on what's called a pull to market model, right? Where it's demand driven, what we call harvest to order. So customers place their orders based on what's going to be available or what's still in the fields. And then when the orders are closed off, then the orders go through to the farms or the market gardens, and then they harvest it either the day before or the day of packing, where it then gets packed and delivered. And so in some cases, you'll have an item that's picked in the morning and on the customer's doorstep in the afternoon and possibly on their plate that evening. And because it's moved so quickly from gate to plate, it hasn't needed any packaging. It hasn't really needed any refrigeration. It's super fresh and so super nutrient dense. And then, of course, the flavor is full as well when in that scenario.
Yeah, that's amazing. To maybe bring it to life for people, I'll just use the example of what we're doing in GIY using the platform. So we took on a market garden last year, which is about 12 acres. And we've got an organic veg box scheme that we grow the stuff, mainly veg and eggs at the moment. And people come and they sign up for a weekly box. They come here to Grow HQ at the moment and pick it up on a Saturday. So as you say, it can literally be harvested either that day or the previous day and on their plates that evening. And when we were sort of looking around, what system can we use to make this happen? And we use Shopify as our kind of main retail platform, but it really wasn't working to sort of, handle that. And so we came across Ooooby. Don't know why it took us so long, considering I'd met you previously. But anyway, that says a lot about my management style. But anyway, and it just did it so seamlessly because it's exactly what Ooooby is for and what it does. And it's worked. We got up and running literally within a couple of weeks, I think, and got live at the end of July and so on. So how typical is our model, I suppose, for your classic customer? Are we very similar, or are we slightly different, or how does it stack up?
Really quite similar. I think one of the things that's fascinated me, having worked with box schemes or farms selling direct or food hubs in different places around the world, is that they all seem to converge on a similar model eventually. It's the one that works.
Yeah.
So it is quite a classic. I mean, there are differences. There are some that do home delivery, but in that case, they'll typically charge a delivery fee, which covers the cost of doing that for the customers. But it means that you become relevant to a lot more customers. Some of them have operate more like a CSA, where they want the customers to pay for the whole season up front, and use that money to sort of cash flow the season. Others are more operating like a box scheme, a farm box or a veg box scheme, where the customer can just pay on a weekly basis, and they can add eggs and bread and milk and cheese and meats and whatever, and basically a full farm shop model. The operational system is consistent, and that is that you sell first and then deliver next. So you're basically, you're harvesting what the demand requires. And that way, you're not harvesting more than what the demand requires. So there's very little waste.
Yeah.
You're just moving it through. That makes a huge difference to cost as well.
Yeah, we've seen that, in fairness, because exactly as you say, we know exactly how many boxes we've got, in the weekend ahead. And depending on the produce, I mean, some produce spoils, obviously, if you don't get to use it. But with other things, they don't. You can leave them in the ground, or you can store them or whatever until they are sold and needed. So it's a fantastic system from that perspective. Sorry, you were going to say something there.
Well, I was just going to say about those more perishable produce items, say courgettes, for example.
Yeah. You don't want those bad boys turning into marrows.
No, you don't. You don't. But the great thing is that because there's an element where you can, to a large degree, determine what's going into your customers' boxes, you can curate your boxes to take into account when the perishable goods are ready to go. Even in that regard, you still get to manage the waste much more effectively than sort of just pushing the product to market and seeing who buys what.
I think you've really painted a brilliant picture there of the sort of spectrum from like CSA, where it like feels very, it's super supportive of the producer, in the sense that you're literally paying maybe 500 quid or 700 quid up front. You're bankrolling the production for a year and so on. And as the name suggests, it's community supported agriculture. So sort of the antithesis of the sort of classic consumer model. And at the other end of the spectrum, on your platform, at any rate, you've got, much more choice. You've got people being able to curate what they want in the box. They're maybe having it delivered to the house. So it much more closely resembles the sort of retail system as we know it. Is there inevitable progression from one end of the spectrum to the other? Like the market kind of demands that it's easier for the consumer and better value for money. Do you feel like you can see that transition happening across your kind of customers, or no?
Yeah, it depends. In some cases, there are CSAs which are very staunchly, and purist CSA.
Yeah.
And this is how we do it, and we don't want customers that are, pernickety about the fact that they don't want Jerusalem artichokes in their box. If that's what we've grown, that's what's in season, that's what you get, and we're here to serve people who understand that. Then you've got CSAs that start up that way, and they've got their core customer base that will pay the whole season up front, but it's not a big enough customer base to be able to sustain the total cost of operations and employment and so forth. So then they'll add the option for people to be able to pay weekly. The people who are paying weekly might pay a little bit more per delivery than the ones who made the commitment up front. But it means they're able to serve that next tier of customers who would love to be able to pay up front, but they just can't afford to pay up front, or they just know that if they were to get a box of something random, that they'd end up throwing half of it away because the kids just won't eat it. Yeah. So then there's that next tier of customers. And then you've got your next tier of customers, and they're the ones that say, I want to have full control over what goes into my box. I want to pick it myself because I'm a real foodie. I like to curate my meals, and I want to get the best food, hence the reason I'll buy it from here. But I want to get what I want, the way I want, in the proportions I want, that then serves the next tier of customers. So you'll have some of what we refer to as hubs, which can be a farm or it can be a local food hub.
GOI is a hub in your terminology, effectively.
Yeah, exactly. GOI is the hub. I mean, the hub is quite literally the packing shed. The hub is where everything comes in, is sort of collated and packed and dispatched from. And in most cases, that is a shed on the farm that's producing most of the food. It's the function that connects the customers with the producers. Some will just have a very narrow range of produce that they produce themselves at one end of the spectrum, and it's a full pay up front. And then you've got all your different stages along the spectrum to the other end where you'll have a full farm shop experience where you can subscribe or you can just buy one off as and when you like, and you can get everything you would expect to get, but it's online.
A quick one. Now, I know you get asked on almost every podcast these days to hit that follow or subscribe button, but they never really tell you why that's important. Simply put, if you hit the follow button, it helps us to grow the show, get more great guests, and to reach more people just like you. So it's a small gesture from you that means a huge amount to us. Thanks. Now back to the episode. Can you give us a sense then of the scale of it at the moment? Like, how many of these sort of schemes are you supporting through the platform and how many countries?
All right. Well, the first 10 years or 9 years, we got to 3. In the last 4 years, there's now 115 of these food hubs, whether they be farm-based or more urban-based or whatever. There's about 115 of them, typically more than one a week, kind of coming on board as we speak.
Yeah.
So
it feels like it's exploded in more recent times. And as you say, it feels like the tech is at the stage now where it's really probably driving that demand, is it?
Yeah, it is. It is, and I think the market's at that point. A lot of it's got to do with the timing of the market. Obviously, COVID had a big impact on people's shopping habits and disrupting the way people think about buying food, so that a lot of people went online. That had a big impact. The reason people have stuck with it is because the experience is just better than they expected. The prices are actually far more competitive than they thought. The convenience is super convenient. It lands on your doorstep. Of those 115 hubs, the countries are primarily the UK, but then, of course, as you mentioned, Ireland. There's in Poland and Norway, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States. We're not pushing into any of these regions. We're more focusing on, our own backyard, UK, where we are now. But the product is available across any European, it trades in euros or US dollar or Canadian dollar. So it's just an open platform that's kind of geographically agnostic.
Like 115, customers for you, for want of a better word, using the platform. How many families would that be serving? Do you know?
Around 13,000.
Wow.
There's about 13,000 households at the moment that buy, a box every week or two. And
about 50,000 individuals, I guess, something like that.
Probably, yeah. When you talk about this from the households, and then when you take into account the supply base that stands behind these hubs. So, as I mentioned before, a lot of the hubs, or most of the hubs, are farms themselves or market gardens themselves. But throughout the seasons, they're typically buying in from other neighbouring farms or artisan producers like bakeries and local bakers, or an egg farm or a chicken farm, or someone who's making chutneys and jams and so forth. So there's often a supply base behind each of these hubs, which can be anywhere from sort of 10 to 20 different suppliers throughout the year. So you're looking at somewhere in the order of between 1,000 and 2,000 small-scale food producers that are benefiting in one way or another by selling their products through the platform.
Math's never been my strong point, but I do have my trusty calculator at the ready here. That suggests like an average of about 110 or so households per garden or per farm, which is, I think this brings us to the central question. Like, if you think about your original goal of kind of having an alternative to the sort of commercial food system that's focused around local food producers and growers, but is also, viable and efficient and can compete.
Yep.
I've pondered this a lot for ourselves here with our market garden, that we're somewhere near that kind of 100 mark. We're about 80 customers currently. And we've 13 acres of land, so I would assume we can probably get to about 150 customers. What's your sense of like how much of a dent that can put in the food system? Like, how viable is it as an alternative? Is it a model that can work, do you think?
Yeah, I think it can. I think the way to look at it is if you can get a model to work, if you can get this one instance of this model to work well and sustainably, if you take 100 customers and you look at an average transaction value of, say, £20 or €20, there's £2,000 or euros a week in revenue. That's 8,000 a month in revenue. Running the hub side of the operation, which is all the packing and the deliveries and customer service and so forth, that's between 1 to 3 people, really. And if it's 3, it's not 3 full time. So you're looking at sort of 1.5 to 2 full time equivalents to be able to run the hub side of the equation, not the market gardening side. And so it creates a decent, employment opportunity for a small team to be able to just do this system week in, week out, working together, doing something they enjoy, which means it can sustain itself. There's different optimal sort of sizes, but between 150 and 200 customers is a really optimal size hub, right? You don't need to add that many more people to sort of nearly double the amount of volume you're pushing out. Most of the systems are in place, but you're increasing your revenue quite a lot. And so you're building a buffer in there, you're allowing people to have a decent income. And so sort of up to 200s are really optimal. When you go above 200, you typically then need to invest in more equipment and a bit more space. Resources. And then you got more team members, which means more lines of communication. So you got to get more precise and, which is great. Then the next kind of sweet spot's around about sort of 500 customers. I guess the point I'm making is that, if you can get between 100 and 200 customer hub is a sustainable, viable model, then it all comes down to how many hubs there are as to how much impact it can make on the food system. Yeah. And I think that's the goal with us is if we can make the system work, I think we have achieved now and we keep improving on it. But by having the system work to enable someone to be able to say, I'm going to get in on this game. All right, I'm going to get in on the game of producing or even just selling and distributing food that's grown in my local area, that's grown ecologically sound to local households. And I'm going to be able to make a decent living doing that and doing something that I feel proud of doing. If we can do that, then as many people out there that see that as being a kind of lifestyle that they would really enjoy is as many hubs as there could be. And who knows the number? I mean, we've got 8 billion people on the planet. There's already 500 million small-scale farms on the planet, 500 million of them. But then all the people who would love to be able to make a living like this, who now there's a platform where they can say, well, I know how to get started, and there's a tried and true tested method of doing it.
Yeah, and very small plots of land. I think that's the other thing that strikes me. For I think most of your hubs, this is like regenerative or organic or certainly very focused on soil health and nutrient density, all those things that you said. So the potential for it to, produce quite a lot of food, support the food needs of a lot of households and families from very small plots of land, managing the land and the soil in a way that's, not having a big impact on the planet. And also then food that's really nutrient dense and nutritious and delicious. That's a pretty compelling mix, isn't it?
I think it is. I mean, there's a J.M. Fortier. He runs a Market Garden Institute in Canada. He's been working with thousands of people getting into market gardening. The way he says it is, instead of mass-produced food, it's food produced by the masses. Yeah, and I think that's a really compelling concept, is realizing that no one has to do an enormous amount of work, but by having this replication happening, an enormous amount of impact can be had. And, some people ask, how are you going to scale this? It's not about scaling, it's about replication.
Yeah. Like obviously the platform takes a percentage, I would say a very small percentage, for providing the platform and processing all the orders and so on. From your side, like, is it getting to that point where it can kind of, not only wash your face, but you can kind of invest in what you need to invest in? Is it reliant on sort of some grant funding and things still, or is it rocking it commercially?
It is rocking it commercially. The thing is that we have needed to get investment. We don't take any grant funding. We've had one grant, but that was a small grant specifically to help design our steward ownership model. But the way that we cover our costs is through trade, is through our revenue, as well as through investments by impact investors. I think it was about 2 years ago, it was profitable. We were covering all of our costs and we had a little bit of surplus, but we wanted to grow our team because we wanted to keep improving the platform, and we wanted to make it more applicable to more sort of small scale business types. We got some investment in order to hire some more engineers, and that was successful, and we've got more engineers on board. We are in that growth phase where we're using investment in order to be able to increase our capacity, in order to be able to grow to the next sort of break even profit point. And then we've got to decide at that point is like, okay, will we continue to fund our own growth going forward, or is there enough demand out there to keep investing in the product to do another investment round? So it's a combination of both revenue from trade as well as investment from impact investors.
Very good. That's a phenomenal model. Just what you were saying about that optimal number of customers kind of brings up the question, I guess, of consumer behavior, I guess, which is like, we have about 80 customers, as I said, and we're seeing sort of constant recruitment and some people cancelling. We expected a little bit of that. People want to try it out and so on. It's not a massive percentage, but it's sort of enough for us to be thinking, well, why are people cancelling, and asking that question. And the two big things that come up are the choice issue. So I'd love to be able to choose what I put in the box. And then the second one is, I don't know what to do with the veg, or I don't know what some of the veg is. So there's no quality issue. They're delighted with the quality of the food. You can see, I guess, that there's levers that we can pull for some of those problems. We can put recipe cards into the box and so on. I think we want to try and avoid going down you curate your own box, because I think, like, for a very small team, the scale we're at the moment, offering loads of choice like that creates huge logistical kind of headaches for us at the moment. But it does raise that question around, as consumers, are we just in a mindset now where convenience and price override sustainability, health, supporting local food, etc.? What do you see from around the network that sort of addresses those issues?
Yeah. Well, it does seem that if you look at the whole market like a bell curve, the ones at the very, very start of the bell curve are the first customers you get. They'll figure out how to cook it up, because if they haven't come across it before, and they'll be satisfied with whatever you deliver to them, because ideologically they're very aligned and they get it. The further up the bell curve you go, the more you need to cater to their whims. And I think that's just the nature of the reality, is just, if you want to start to cater for and start to encourage people who otherwise wouldn't put themselves out to buy direct from a local market garden or something like that, you just need to be able to offer those extra little conveniences.
Yeah.
That's actually what we've really been focused on, is just like you said, the idea of offering custom boxes to your customers, it is a logistical nightmare. But that's what we've built the software to manage, that nightmare component of it, because so much of it is just really repetitive, just a heavy cognitive load to manage it all. We've recognized that if we can make it so that having exclusions is actually quite easy to do logistically, practically, and having custom boxes is actually a lot easier to do practically than if you had to kind of figure it out on all spreadsheets and things like that, then the move to be able to offer that level of convenience, to be able to serve that next tier of customers, isn't going to be as big a sort of hurdle as you think.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. Without the right tools, they can be the undoing of you when you try to offer too much choice and too much convenience, because you end up burning out and you can't keep up with that demand. But if we want to change the food system and chip away at it from the outside in, we just have to accept that price and convenience are human nature's driving motivators. So we work on our end to make it as easy as possible to offer that price and convenience to your customers so that you can serve that next tier of customers.
Yeah.
If you want to.
It feels like couriers, like the improvements in the courier system, a lot of which was kind of led by COVID, I guess, even to the point where you can choose a sort of a courier that uses electric vehicles and so on if you want. So you don't need to be necessarily thinking about the kind of the planetary impact of all that food being couriered around. But like next day deliveries, reliable next day deliveries in a culture where we accept that feels like that unlocks kind of nationwide deliveries for us potentially, for example, whereas our sample size in Waterford are of consumers that are willing to support the no choice kind of model. We can kind of go much bigger, and that brings opportunities, right?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's always better to have someone from the team deliver it to your doorstep, and it's such a nice thing to kind of say, oh, look, there's one of the DIY guys who's delivering the But you're right, as long as the customer is willing to pay the cost of the courier fee so that it's not chipping away at your revenue. Yes, the courier systems are becoming more and more sophisticated, more reliable, more trackable. It is one of those things. It's just like when the iPhones came out or the smartphones came out, it unlocked a new opportunity for small scale. I think in a similar way, this sophisticated couriering network is another unlock.
The listener to this podcast who might be kind of food curious, like clearly is food curious if they're listening to this and interested in everything we're talking about here, but maybe, does the kind of classic weekly shop in the supermarket or whatever. What's the pitch to them, do you think? What can we do to be supporting the local food movement?
Yeah, well, there's two sides to the pitch, I think. One is what's in it for them, and the other one is how can they help to improve the food system? What can they do? I think what's in it for them is better value for money, better food. In the last 3 years, we've seen so much food inflation, like we've not seen before in our lifetimes anyway. And the reason the food prices are going up so rapidly is a large contributing factor is all the different layers of intermediaries that are involved in getting the food from the gate to the plate. And each layer has had its own inflationary effects applied to it. And which means that as the more layers, the more hands your food goes through, the higher the compounding effect of the end retail price. That's why food inflation is higher than general inflation, one of the contributing factors. When you're buying it direct, firstly, smaller scale operators don't have the same costs involved in, maintaining large electricity bills and, cool rooms and all these sort of heavy infrastructure costs. Secondly, they're not putting any inputs like fertilizers and pesticides and so forth into the fields because they're able to manage it at a human scale. So they don't have those costs. And then they're also handling their own supply chain, right? Because it's small enough operation that they can do the growing, the packing, the deliveries, and the customer service themselves. So they don't have any of these compounding inflationary effects, which means that they can actually deliver much better value for money without it really being a cost to them. So for most people out there, they think, oh, if I want cheap groceries and I want to go to, Lidl or whoever's got the best promotion on that month, right? Reality, when you actually add it up and you think for value for money, these days, buying direct is better value for money. And the money's going straight to the source where you want the money to go to. It is super convenient. Ideally, we all get up on a Saturday morning and get down to the farmer's market and meet the farmer and buy our shopping like that. But for most of us, we just don't have the time. We've got to take our kids to football. We've got to do this and that, and we just can't get there. This is effectively you're being able to buy direct from the local producers from your phone, and you either can select to pick it up from a pickup point, or you can have it delivered to your door in a lot of cases. So it's as convenient as any of the other big players out there. Price-wise, it's often better value for money. I think the one area that we're working on, and as we'll continue to improve, is choice, range. Some hubs that offer a really vast range, which is great, and they typically have more customers because they're relevant to more people. The experience from a shopper's point of view is I get better food by far better food. It's fresher, it's no packaging, good value for money, it's super convenient. And I get to be part of the solution. My grocery budget is actually a vote for a better food system. And it's, in a way, it's activism in its own right, just by choosing to shop that way.
Absolutely. That's brilliant. Like, I think nutrient density is also something that it's a little bit hard to measure, obviously, but that's the tech I'd love to see you develop next, Pete, is like, give me an app on my phone that I can scan an apple and it'll tell me how nutrient dense it is, because like apple A, imported from France or New Zealand or whatever, or apple B, produced on a local kind of regeneratively managed farm, the nutrient density, I think, is just, they're not comparable. And so that should be part of the equation of what represents value for money and currently isn't, So I think that's a huge thing. And certainly the feedback we get from our customers is they appreciate the taste and the freshness and the quality of the food so much as well. Is there anything you wish you'd known when you started out, when you founded Ooooby?
Kind of no, because if I had known how tough it was going to be, I probably wouldn't have embarked on the journey. Mick, you've experienced over the same length of time in this space. It's not for the faint-hearted. This is a tough place. We're swimming against the current. It's satisfying and rewarding in a lot of ways. It's a very tough ride. It has been a very tough ride. So had I known that, I probably would have thought twice and gone, actually, I'm not really up for it. Yeah. But fortunately, I didn't know that.
$12 million in annual sales, feeling very nice right about now.
I know. Mate, I've got to try and block that out of my memory. I think, there are decisions that I've made in the past. I sort of think, I wish I didn't do that. But then, you learn from them.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything in particular that I would rather have not happened or that I'd have known before. Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I'm sure you've had some very, very tough times. You kind of hinted at that a little bit over the years, trying to make this all work. And what are your kind of go-to foods for getting you through times like that?
For me personally, that I eat, eggs and avocado. They're my go-to. Some cherry tomatoes and a bit of salt and pepper. I mean, are you still making the odd croissant, I hope?
No, I'm not. Have you given that up completely?
I think I got my fill of those. Occasionally I'll grab a croissant from a farm shop if I'm passing by, but my go-to foods are fairly basic sort of staple items.
Yeah.
Good fuel with some good flavor.
Our closing question that we ask all our guests, why does food matter to Pete Russell?
It matters to me more from the point of view of it is such a fundamental layer to humanity in general. Like society, we can't do anything without having a system by which we feed ourselves. And of all the things that I would love to see the future deliver, none of it's possible if we don't have a good food system to be able to nourish us as we take on those amazing, opportunities of being alive. It's one of those fundamental layers that if we don't pay attention could really be a proper undoing of us. So really, I love food. I'm right into food, but my deeper motivation is more about what does food facilitate? It facilitates a healthy society, and from a healthy society, so much more is possible.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I absolutely love that. Pete, it's been an absolute joy having you on, and I'm always so fascinated by the people who, to use your phrase, are chipping away at the status quo, and I know how hard it is and how hard you've worked to make a success of this. It feels like a brilliant sort of circular moment where we started using the platform ourselves in GIY after having you at the gathering in 2012, all those years ago. So hats off to you. Keep sort of fighting the fight, but also doing something like that's actually viable and sustainable and making a difference. It's an absolutely brilliant achievement. So thank you for all your work and for coming on the pod. It's been brilliant to catch up, and hopefully we'll get you back to Waterford before too long.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mick. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you for carrying on and keeping the banner flying.
Sure, look, what else would you be doing?
Exactly.
Thanks a million, Pete.
All right. Cheers, Mick. Have a great one.
Cheers, man. Thanks a million. That's it for this episode of Food Matters, but we would love you to get more connected to the GIY universe. So we believe that our food system is having a catastrophic impact on people's health and the health of our planet. And we think a movement of people growing some of their own food is the way to fix it. You can stay connected to GIY by signing up to our free newsletter and check out our full range of events, campaigns, resources and courses at giy.ie. Check out the show notes for more information. Thanks for listening and see you soon.